Evening. Come on, can we just give ourselves a round of applause? We're all back in overflow rooms. Not only do the conversation you're about to hear, bring together two of the country's most prolific and renowned presidential historians, it also promises to advance our understanding of the arc of American policymaking that has helped shape the issues and challenges of this country from the Civil War era to the present day. As Jon Meacham's new book shows, the legacy of the Civil War continues to inform how we think about polarized America in which we live. Lincoln called the challenge of our unfinished work the march to pursue the American dream of a more equitable society characterized by equal access to what he called the race of life. That dream was shared by Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, who lived in this house for the 25 years before they left to enter the White House themselves. Both Roosevelts were genuine admirers of Lincoln. Eleanor called him the epitome of our ideal of democracy. And FDR, too, saw in Lincoln both a leadership example and, to be honest, a political opportunity. As early as 1929, FDR told his friends that it was time for us Democrats to claim Lincoln as one of our own. Thereafter, he rarely missed an opportunity to quote Lincoln or to cite him as his own guiding light. By the way, in 1938, FDR even delivered his own Gettysburg Address on the 75th anniversary of the famous battle. Not to be competitive, but that's about 10 times the number of people that heard Lincoln give his Gettysburg Address there. Then FDR actually hired Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright Robert Sherwood, fresh off his Broadway hit, Abe Lincoln in Illinois, to write Lincoln-like speeches for him about American destiny and resolve. So the connections between the Roosevelt and Lincolns run deep. And this evening, we have another Pulitzer Prize winner to continue that dialogue. Jon Meacham has written powerfully about a wide range of unforgettable figures in American history, including FDR, as well as Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, George Herbert Walker Bush, the late Congressman John Lewis, and now Abraham Lincoln in this new book. Doris Kearns Goodwin has called it biography at its best, and John, for us, that's about as good as you can get. John has served as a contributing editor to Time magazine and editor-in-chief of Newsweek. Today, he is the canon historian of the Washington Cathedral and distinguished visiting professor of history at Vanderbilt, while engaging all of us in the classroom of ideas as a commentator on CBS, MSNBC, and PBS. He is also a counselor to President Biden, and although he doesn't say so for the record, we all could sense firsthand in the president's major speeches John's influence, including last week's State of the Union. That's no secret, because the New York Times reported twice that John spent some time at Camp David working with the president on that address. Before we begin, John, I want to take the opportunity personally to express our gratitude for your narration of the Channel 13 film Treasures of New York on the rehabilitation and renovation of Roosevelt House, one of our most proudest achievements. I had the great pleasure of appearing alongside of you off camera upstairs in the FDR Library, the room where Social Security was born. I think President Biden may have made mention of that initiative in the State of the Union. From the first, you recognize... Touché. From the first, you recognize how hard we had to fight to save and repurpose this extraordinary building. As you put it, quote, here history was made, and here history was almost lost. You've always been a great fan of Roosevelt House, and the fact that you helped us put it on the map connects you to Hunter College for all times in this sacred space. You epitomize, John, the Hunter College motto, mihi cura futuri, the care of the future is mine. And we deeply appreciate all of your efforts to use the lesson of the past to inform the present and inspire a better future. Tonight, John will be in conversation with your fellow historian, someone, as I said, who knows a thing or two about presidential history and Lincoln himself, our Jonathan Fanton Roosevelt House director, the great Harold Holzer. Harold is the author of more than 50 books about Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War, including most recently, The Presidents and the Press, From the Founding Fathers to Fake News. We could not possibly have a more expert interlocutor at the helm of tonight's conversation, and I know we all look forward to an enthralling and enlightening discussion between these two heavyweight historians. With that, please join me in welcoming Jon Meacham in conversation with Harold Holzer.
I never had a bar mitzvah, but this must be it. Thank you, Madam President.
I had one. There's no food here. Just just saying. I just want to say before we start, and you'll probably hear me say this all semester long, as we meet here, there would not be a program, there would not be a series of programs, there would not be an auditorium, there probably would not be a Roosevelt House if it were not for the work of the woman who, it's hard to believe, is leaving us in 4 months, President Jennifer Raab. So, John, welcome back to Roosevelt House, right?
Thank you. I must say, the president said we were acclaimed presidential historians. Being the most acclaimed presidential historian is like being the best restaurant in a hospital. You know, you want to win, but it's not that hard. So, but thank you. Harold is. I'm not.
So this is, in case you didn't know, this is President's Week.
Yes.
And you've been traveling widely on your book. And you've toured as well in the past, of course, on Jackson and Bush and your other books. I'm just wondering, as you travel across the country, is there a change that you perceive in people's regard for the presidency? Have the controversies of the last 10 years, the quote divisions of the last 10 years, changed American attitudes toward the presidency?
That's a fabulous question, and I never say that to Harold, so it's genuine. There is a nostalgia. There is, if you take pains to come hear me, you're probably not wearing a red hat. I'll explain that to y'all later if you don't have them here. I forgot which zip code we're in. You may have never seen one, but there's the first question I've gotten for now. Has it been 6 years? Yeah, six or 7 years, is, has it ever been this bad? And I used to say, yeah, Fort Sumter was pretty bad, which is clever, but it's not dismissive. It's important to remember that divisions are perennial, the forces that divide us ebb and flow, and they've been flowing too strongly. And the best we can do, I believe, is make them ebb. You don't eradicate human forces of appetite and ambition, you just manage them. Which the founders understood, and Lincoln understood, obviously. So that's the first question. The second question, particularly on Lincoln, which fascinated me, and I was too stupid to realize it in real time, but I started out talking about Lincoln in mid-October of last year. And as a boringly heterosexual white Southern male Episcopalian, that's me, I was, some of that's redundant. I'll let you work out what it is. I was ready for every question to be about race. What is a privileged white boy who grew up on Missionary Ridge in Tennessee writing about the emancipation of 4 million? I got almost no questions about race. The questions I got, first, second, and third, were about democracy. How do you preserve the Constitution in the face of active forces that wish it harm? And then somebody would ask it a different way. And then they'd ask it a different way. And it's not just because most of my audiences, this one accepted, of course, are older, and they would have forgotten what the previous question was, although that does happen every once in a while. There's a reason I write quickly. Beschloss and I have a bet, at what point will books we write go straight to large print? So gives you some sense of what we're talking about. But it was a sign of where the midterm electorate was going to be. And I didn't quite connect those dots until the election deniers lost. And I think it was, really, and you helped me with this, we've talked about this offline, it's very hard to get people to vote for an idea that is not of immediate benefit to them, right? The idea of a democratic republic, that doesn't lend itself to a hat, right? Madisonian checks and balances, woo, you know. Even Madison was bored by Madison. But it worked this time. And I think for just enough of us, which is what America is, right? Just enough of us doing the right thing just enough of the time. And so I think that, at least the people I talk to, there's a regard for the presidency, there's a regard for politics as we knew them. I do warn against when people say, oh, things were so much better, in the old days. And I'll say, what old days? And they'll say, well, the 80s. I'll say, well, you all voted against Reagan. What are you talking about? Remember Pauline Kael said she couldn't believe Richard Nixon won in 1972 because she didn't know anyone who voted for him? That might be true on the West Side, but it's a big country. And so I resist that kind of nostalgia. I think the importance of talking about the past in moments like this is to show that we do have the capacity to overcome elemental threats. And everything we can do to remind ourselves of why we're in this covenant with each other, I believe actually helps us preserve that covenant.
So we have also talked about, and I've heard you speak publicly on this subject, of what set Lincoln apart, why he's consistently ranked the greatest president in popular polls and in historians' polls. And you've said, and then I'll let you elaborate on your own comment, but I want you to know that I remembered what you
did
said.
I say? Yeah.
You said he did just enough right, just enough of the time.
Score. Okay. That's really well put, Harold.
Which, of course, I tend to think is an underestimation of his achievements, but you can run with it. What did his leadership mean in that most fraught time when, by the way, an insurrection actually worked? Not at the Capitol.
Totally.
They tried at the Capitol, but it didn't work.
Right, Winfield Scott took care of it. And John Breckinridge was Mike Pence. There's a sentence you don't hear every Thursday night. I'm very excited to hang out with.
Who was a candidate for the presidency.
And together, we're doubly excited. This is like the two old guys in the Muppet balcony.
Waldorf and Astor.
Exactly. So, but you took pains to be here, so it's your funeral. I think what made Lincoln do it, he believed in the Declaration of Independence. He believed in the Constitution, but was willing to bend it and stretch it, understandably. Thomas Jefferson never had a better friend than Abraham Lincoln. If you need a friend, find someone who will love you as Lincoln loved Thomas Jefferson. He elevates the Declaration above the Constitution. He makes the assertion of human equality the guiding American principle. He refers to the founders as men of iron. He was a key architect of the American civic religion, which is the American civic structure, really. We have scripture, we have martyrs and apostles at the beginning, prophets, and that gave us a guide to conduct, a sense of national destiny, although as Lincoln put it, we are God's almost chosen people, Americans, and that guide to conduct that sees us through what the Israelites understood to be history as a beginning, a middle, and an end. We're past the beginning, we're in the middle, and what we do in the middle will determine what happens to us at the end. And so our conduct is not just right for the sake of right, we are rewarded or punished in the degree to which we act according to those principles. And you can take that entirely out of the religious realm if you want, but in 19th century America, that's the way people thought about it. I believe that what made Lincoln Lincoln was obviously everything that Harold has written so wonderfully about, and his great political skill. My view is, if you had simply been a politician, there's always a reason if you're a politician to do the thing you didn't do. Everything's a close call, right? And there were three moments: the proposal of a compromise in January of 1860-61 that would have avoided civil war in the short term, would have stopped the secession, was hoped to stop the secession crisis, but it would have extended slavery into the federal territories. and thereby crushed the principle on which the Republican Party had won the presidency. However, arguably the second most famous Republican in America was open to it, Seward. Lincoln was not. Politically, it was the right thing to do. Why didn't he do it? It was a defensible thing to do. Why didn't he do it? He actually believed slavery was wrong and had to be regulated, and thought that by extending it, the principle collapsed. My analogy for this, very roughly, is it's like Churchill in May of 1940. Appeasement had not worked. 4 presidential administrations tried to add Cuba to the Union. The Golden Circle was going to have Havana in the center. Mexico, Nicaragua had been taken over by a filibuster from Tennessee, branded as the gray-eyed man of destiny. He knew a hashtag, a guy named William Walker. He saw, and Lincoln wrote all this, he saw a compromise in that moment as a fatal capitulation to the slave power. I believe if they'd taken that deal, can't prove this obviously, slavery would have endured in America into the 20th century. I really do. I don't. And Lincoln himself proposed a gradual compensation plan that would have taken effect fully in 1900. So why didn't he do it? Why didn't he take that deal? He didn't take it because I believe he had a genuine moral commitment against slavery and for the Constitution, which he believed, in his interpretation, did not sanction the expansion of slavery. That's one. The other was the fortification of Fort Sumter. Scott and Seward, again, kind of wobbly. Lincoln was not. And then in 1864, in August, when it looks as though he's going to lose re-election, Henry Raymond comes down from New York, the chairman of the Republican National Committee, and says, if you don't put emancipation on the table, reverse the Niagara Declaration, you will lose the election. And he said, okay. I mean, it took several days to get to okay. But he wrote the famous Blind Memorandum saying that if this administration loses, I will be compelled to help save the Union between the election and the inauguration. So what was it? What was the factor there? To me, it was a moral anti-slavery commitment. And I think that sets him apart. Doesn't make him perfect, doesn't make him Martin Luther King in a stovepipe hat, but it sure as hell doesn't make him a target for cancellation either.
I agree with you that Jefferson had no better friend in Lincoln's advocacy of the Declaration rather than the Constitution, unless he wanted to talk about the Constitution as his guide, as his guiding star. He was also, I'm asking the perfect person here because you've written the award-winning book about Jackson. You've also written about Jefferson. When he wanted to, he talked about Jackson. So at the beginning, you know, when the governor of Maryland comes to him in 1861 and the mayor of Baltimore and says, I don't want your troops crossing my territory, inciting riots to get to Washington, he says, among his other great lines, he says, there's no manhood in that. There's no Jackson in that.
Right.
And Jackson is the person he began his political career as by opposing.
Yeah.
What does Jackson do for him? How does he inspirit his resistance to secession?
I think it's fair to say, and Stephen Schlesinger is here, whose father I think would have agreed with this. I think it's very fair to say presidents are always against executive power until they have it. And then suddenly you're preserving the Constitution, and you're Thomas Jefferson buying Louisiana, you're Jackson and nullification, you're TR. TR wanted to be. He said, I'm not going to be a Cleveland, I'm going to be a Jackson. Lincoln is a very Jacksonian figure as a cultural figure. Remember, the first 6 American presidents were either Virginia slave owners or Adams is from Massachusetts. Jackson becomes the first self-made man, to borrow a phrase from someone he hated, Henry Clay, to rise to the pinnacle. Law, military, made his fortune, poorly educated in a formal sense, hugely shaped by the sermons he heard, because sermons were, in fact, the only thing people did hear. Remember, I mean, they didn't go back on the frontier to watch Netflix, right? There wasn't a theater. There were sermons. There weren't political meetings in the early 19th century in the way we think of it. So he's a Jacksonian figure culturally. And then, I think I have this right, in January and February of 1861, he's above his brother-in-law's store, right, in Springfield, writing the inaugural address, the first inaugural. And he sends for Henry Clay's 1850 compromise speech. He sends for the Declaration, and he sends for Andrew Jackson's proclamation of the people of South Carolina from Monday, December 10th, 1832, which Andrew Jackson wrote so fast that the paper fell off his desk. He had a stand-up desk in what is now the Lincoln bedroom, falling off the table, in which he said, "I speak to you with the feelings of a father, saying that if you destroy this union, I will destroy you, fundamentally." Jackson put the Union above everything else. And it's actually an interesting moment in Jacksonian history because if things had been slightly different, he would have been a nullifier. And what he agreed with Calhoun, the architect of this, on slavery, on removal, but by God, they weren't going to trample on the Constitution as Jackson saw it. That's a very useful model when it comes to 1861. I have a theory that presidents see as they wish to be seen. When presidents quote other presidents, it's always in search of sanction or inspiration or sort of signaling everyone, think of me in this way. When President Kennedy said, "This is the greatest gathering of talent at the White House, with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone," or Harold Holzer, same thing. What he was saying is a charming thing to say at a Nobel Prize dinner, but what he was kind of saying was, aren't I rather like Thomas Jefferson to think to invite all of you here, right? I've written books, you know, although, as he would point out, there's a reason Profiles in Courage was one volume and short. You know, they're not a lot of material. But I think Jackson was a useful soldier to enlist in the cause of union. Can I tell my Hermitage story very quickly? It's about three of my favorite topics. This is a true story. It's about Andrew Jackson, Donald Trump, and George Herbert Walker Bush. I know it sounds like a joke, and there's a rabbi and all that. So this is a true story. So in March of 2017, President Trump announces that he's coming down to Nashville, where I live, to lay a wreath at the grave of Andrew Jackson and sort of embrace Jackson. I think he thought it was Neverland, but anyway. So he's coming down, and I'm sitting at home, and I think I should do something about this. So I wrote an open letter to the president, saying, "Dear Mr. President, delighted you're coming. Welcome, glad you're embracing history. But if you're going to embrace Andrew Jackson, don't just embrace the crazy parts." And there are plenty of crazy parts of Andrew Jackson to embrace, right? He once said his only two regrets in public life were that he had not shot Henry Clay and hung John C. Calhoun, right? His own vice president, you know, passed his prologue. But, and in a very kind of bold move, I thought, for a Gannett paper, the local newspaper ran it. It was the entire front page of the paper was my letter to Trump when he arrived. And it had no effect whatever on President Trump. The next day, again, true story, I'm walking into lunch and my phone rings, and it was George Herbert Walker Bush. And President Bush had spent a lot of that, he was 91 at that point, had spent a lot of that winter in the hospital in Houston, and so his staff was printing out stuff for him to read. They gave him this piece I'd written, and he called up, he said, "How you doing?" I said, "I'm fine, Mr. President. How are you?" Dana Carvey once said, "The key to doing the old man's voice is Mr. Rogers trying to be John Wayne." He said, "I'm fine." He said, "I read your letter to Jackson, and I thought, oh, shit, he thinks I'm writing letters to dead people." And so I said, "Thank you, Mr. President. But, you know, actually, that was a letter to Trump about Jackson." And without missing a beat, the old man said, "Yeah, but Jackson will pay more attention." And then he hung up. He thought of the joke. He wanted to deliver. He said, "See ya." Click. That was it. That was the entire conversation. I'm sure that was responsive somehow.
Somehow.
That's all you'll remember.
So I think we were talking about the usable past.
Yeah, that's
Lincoln's
right. That's right.
embrace
Yes, yes.
of the usable past.
Back to Roosevelt House. Yes.
Let's talk about. I think this is a good digression. Okay. Good digression. Good trouble. We talked about how Lincoln embraced people with whom he was not simpatico naturally, politically, Jefferson, Jackson. And you mentioned the first President Bush, with whom I got to spend quite a bit of time talking about Lincoln. I was astonished at how much he knew, how much he cared about, what meant the most to him in the Lincoln canon. And it was, I think I mentioned this to you, it was the farewell address to Springfield, in which Lincoln said, I'm leaving, here my children have been born and one lies buried. And he said that actually crying, saying, no one but Lincoln and I knows what it's like to go to the White House leaving a child buried in a hometown. It was amazing. Talk about the modern presidents you've spoken to, worked with, written about, and so many presidents, most of the last 25 years of presidents or more, I guess it's 35 years, that I know of have been fascinated with Lincoln and use Lincoln. And what is it, what do they get from him, and what do they need, and what do they use?
Well, I want you to answer some of that, because you probably have more firsthand experience with this. It is interesting to me, there are apparently no other ghosts in the White House.
Right.
Right? Nobody says, oh, I woke up and Richard Nixon was next to my bed, which would be terrifying. So it's interesting that Lincoln is the ghost, right? My impression, certainly the Bushes, certainly President Biden, well, let's just say every president except for the 45th. Let's just cut to the chase. The sane people who have been in the office have, I think, been honestly intimidated by him. The senior President Bush once said, I remember I was asking him this, actually I was talking to both the 41st and the 43rd president together, which was, I wrote a biography, a big, long anyway, not big, biography of George H.W. Bush. It was supposed to be posthumous, but the son of a bitch wouldn't die. I'd bring it up, he'd say, not gonna do it. So I was interviewing the two of them, and I thought it was going to be great. And it was fascinating, but it was not wildly illuminating. Anyway, I said, hoping to hear maybe they was thinking about Eisenhower, right? That Senior Bush is very, kind of Eisenhower-esque, and all that. And the only president he mentioned that he thought about when he was in the White House was Lincoln. And in classic Bush kind of high wasp way, he said, dominant figure. And it's interesting to me that that's true. They don't talk about FDR as much. I think it's because, if I'm thinking about it, if I had to offer a theory, it's the immensity of the war. The notion that at your command, 600 to 700,000 people would be dead. And
the equivalent of 10 million in today's
yeah. And I think that there's something human about wanting to be, even in a kind of figurative conversation, with someone who had it even harder than you. Mm-hmm. That would be my therapeutic advice. What do you think? Why do you think he does? They are.
I think half of it is the ghost thing, the thing that Lincoln hovers around the White House, in the so-called Lincoln bedroom, the cabinet room. He wrote the Gettysburg Address there. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The big portrait in the East Room. He's a presence, even though it's a reconstructed building, of course. He just seems to loom over it. And I think as Lincoln wanted to be Jeffersonian and Jacksonian at the right moment, they want Lincoln to bless their endeavors.
Absolutely.
I mean, look at Obama's victory speech in Chicago. He said, we must be friends, we must not be enemies, quoting the first inaugural, which has now, and President Biden quoted the first inaugural in his inaugural address. So that seems to be the scripture of attempting to reinvent unity in America.
Yeah, it is a sequential canonical. The Lincoln canon is canonical. Yeah.
Right. But not to dwell on the 45th president, but I'll tell you something.
He'd be thrilled, trust me.
So Donald Trump was the only president in my memory who said, I'm really a much better president than Abraham Lincoln. But when Lincoln left Springfield for the presidency and gave that aforementioned speech, he said, I have a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. That's kind of heretical for a president-elect to compare the challenge to that which faced Washington. So I don't know. There's a commonality I've just offered.
Yeah, I really do think it's, I hate to say this, I think it's about death. I think it's about the responsibility, the remarkable responsibility. If you think about it, the only people we ask in our society are some military commanders, perhaps some police officers on occasion, police commanders, and presidents of the United States to have that kind of ultimate power, to put other people's children in harm's way. And speaking of George H.W. Bush crying, I used to get my shoes wet when he would talk about how hard that was. And I think that anything you can hold on to, you're going to grab for.
So critics have said, I think correctly, in praising your book, that it...
I'm sure it was correct if they were praising it. There's usually a but coming.
No. That it's the first biography to really delve into this, the idea of how, or the challenge of how Lincoln negotiated morality and politics. And you've done that so nimbly, and I'd love to hear you talk about it. How did he balance what he thought was moral purpose and political possibility? That's a big question.
It is a big question. I think the reason I did this was I feel I understood how Lincoln did what he did. I didn't feel as though I knew why he did what he did as much as I wanted to. And that led me to the moral formation. And I'm not trying to baptize him. He's in no sense a conventional Christian. Just depends on, that's Jesus saying, wait. Sorry. What did FDR? FDR said, I'm a Christian and a Democrat, that's all. And the Sermon on the Mount is the last word in morality. That was FDR's theology. They used to say about St. James Church in Hyde Park, once God's, now Roosevelt's.
And Lincoln said, when I do good, I feel good. That's my essence of, that's my
when I do
religion.
good, yes. And so it's about conscience. And so how does this man form this? He grew up in an anti-slavery Baptist atmosphere, a white anti-slavery Baptist atmosphere in Kentucky in 1820. How many white anti-slavery Baptists do you think there were in Kentucky at that point? But 3 of them were the original mother and father, and then the stepmother. I don't want to make too much of that, but I do think that the first time he encountered slavery as a subject of conversation was likely in an anti-slavery atmosphere. There's a line that connects these Baptist leaders through John Leland, who was the great dissenter in Virginia, all the way to Wilberforce and Clarkson and others in England. And so I think that's there, but I'm not trying to make him William Lloyd Garrison either. I think it was a basic understanding that there is a right and a wrong, and you want to do right more often than you do wrong. And maybe that sounds Mr. Rogers-esque or something, but it has the virtue, as Dr. Kissinger used to say, of being true. And I think that it was scriptural in the sense of understanding the basic message of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, coming to him through the King James Version. There's Parson Weems. There's the morality of George Washington. I had a good time going back and, again, tells you how exciting my life is, a good time reading the primers that he would have read.
Which very few, no biographers do that. I mean, you not only cited what the books were, but you actually read them.
There was Dillsworth and
Scott's Elocution with all the Shakespearean soliloquies.
so, and there's a lot of Cicero, and there's a lot of there. In fact, there's stuff about with charity toward all. It's interesting to see where. And I think we're all like that, right? So there are phrases we carry around that if we do our archaeological work well enough, we can figure out where we got them.
My next book is going to have a lot of Meacham in it.
I would hope so.
Uncredited.
I would hope so. I would hope it would have a lot. That'll put some rocket fuel. Yeah. That'll make you something, Holzer. Maybe you can get another publishing contract.
I shouldn't start up.
I have a library at home, and then I have the Holzer room, because there are so goddamn many books that he's written. It's amazing. He has no unexpressed thoughts. But I think it's pretty straightforward. I found, and I to some extent I started at the end and worked back. I think the most profound theological statement ever uttered by an American president, and you can check me on that, but I'll debate you on it, was in the second inaugural when Lincoln says, "We both sides pray for the war to end, but it continues, and if it be the case that every drop of blood drawn by the lash must be answered by a drop of blood drawn by the sword, then let it be said that the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether," which I think is Psalm 119. Sit with that for a second. An American president standing on the east front of the Capitol, speaking to one of the first truly large integrated audiences in American history, looking at his old boarding house, which was on Carroll Road to the right, where the Library of Congress now stands, which may have been a stop on the Underground Railroad, but was certainly home to a lot of abolitionists when he was in the House. Frederick Douglass is there, Andrew Johnson is there, having had a little hair of the dog. He says that there's a God who is so interested, there's a divine force who's so interested in the affairs of this particular geographic polity that he's measuring the amount of blood that is spilled in order to right the scales. That's what he's saying. That's what that means. Now, you could say he's saying it for rhetorical effect. How many 19th century folks do you think worked through blood sacrifice? I mean, it is a profound thing to say. And so I thought, how did a non-conventional believer get to that? And it comes to tracing it all the way back to right conduct, that one is rewarded or punished according to the degree to which one lives according to the right. And he insisted that the country do that as well as individuals.
And that was the paragraph that Frederick Douglass thought sacred in the second inaugural, not the one that follows with malice toward none, with charity for all, which worried him. It was the judgments. I mean, you're paying for a national sin, not a regional sin.
It's expiation, exactly. And it's much more interesting and much more, I mean, the last paragraph, I mean, look, it's Lincoln, right? So it's good. But it's conventional. This may be heretical. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right.
It's not bad.
It's not bad, but it's not startling. And in fact, if you're Frederick Douglass and you're worried about Reconstruction, right, it's a little unsettling. With charity for all.
And binding up the nation's wounds. Whose nation, right?
Yeah. For all?
Right.
Really? Can you have repentance without confession? We're still living with that. The paragraph that's so interesting, I think, is this notion that there is a God who is paying attention to the spilling of blood. and that we are expiating a national sin. And that's an American president saying that.
At a moment when he could have said, we've won the war. We've done a great job. We've done a great thing. And he never says that in that remarkable speech. How do you, I mean, this is an unknowable question. Therefore, I
Those
think
are my favorite kind.
your favorites, right? So speaking of lack of schooling, Jackson at least had military training. Lincoln had, taught himself the law and was autodidactic in almost everything he tackled. The mystery to me, the biggest mystery to me, is the writing talent.
Yeah.
I mean, it's unknowable, but it's magical. It is astonishing that someone could spring from the hardscrabble. I don't know if you've ever been to the Knob area. Oh, of course you have. You're from that.
They have bourbon
It's not
there,
the
so
upper, the Bourbon Festival.
Knob Creek.
I'm more Upper West Side, which you denigrated a few minutes ago, I believe.
It was not denigrate. I was simply talking about perhaps there's not a huge amount of ideological diversity.
Well, there's progressive and there's radical.
There you go.
The West
There's
Side.
Marxists and Leninists.
Trotskyists, too. I remember those days. Where was I? So I don't know.
The writing. Where did the writing come from?
The writing.
Are you? I don't know if you're like this. I can sometimes archaeologically figure out why I sound the way I sound when I'm writing. There are writers here. You can figure this out. I think the King James Bible, Shakespeare, he didn't have. Let me put it this way: the inputs were really good, right? The models he had were really good, and there were fewer florid 19th century, what we think of as overwrought Victorian prose. He had less access to that. And he read a lot of sermons. He read a lot of speeches. And by necessity, they weren't as clear as his, but by necessity, speech forces a kind of clarity that even the written word has a harder time doing. I find that in teaching, right? If I don't know, if I'm dancing around, the students know it. And we were talking about this the other day. We have colleagues who have written multi-volume histories of various vast historical subjects. And yet, the thing that's most useful, if you're trying to summarize their argument, is often the published lectures they give after the master work is done, because they have to sum up, and they have to take account of what they have done, and so they're clearer in some ways about their argument when they're talking. And I think Lincoln engaged that kind of literature more than the wider.
I think you're right. If you follow the trail that he wants, you can be diverted sometimes from what he's really thinking. I'm going to ask one more formal question, then we're going to open it up so you all can ask questions. He said once in a letter to a governor, in defense of recruitment of black troops, which this governor was not sympathetic toward. He said, in explaining it, Lincoln said, "I haven't controlled events. Events have controlled me." My view is that was a almost disingenuous political statement. Let's just talk for a minute about Lincoln's ego and self-confidence and what he really thought he was controlling and what he was simply giving to God. Because he also said the will of God prevails. If he wills that this war continue, it will.
I wrestled with this for a long time, and I still haven't pinned it to the mat as well as I would like to. I do think that was disingenuous. I think that if you are genuinely a fatalist, if you think that if you're genuinely a Calvinist, Presbyterians, it's kind of boring, right? If it's all predestined, where's the fun? And so I say that because there are more of them than there are me, so I'm hostile to a Presbyterian. But if you believe that everything is predestined, why would you go into the line of work where individual agency matters more than any other? It's just an odd thing, right? I think you tell yourself that in hours of stress and strain. I think political people have to live with disappointment more often than they do with exhilaration, because they lose more than they win. Because this is a big, complicated, disputatious country, and political leadership in this country is incredibly hard. And so you can, at hours that feel bleaker than they do joyous, it's somewhat reassuring to play Marcus Aurelius. Well, it's all fated, you know. My luck has to turn because things are. I think, I just don't believe he didn't see himself as one of the most important human agents of his time, and now we know of all time. And so I've always found that, and we have, again, there are important books written that take as gospel, if you will, or is stipulated that he saw himself as an instrument, as opposed to an instrument of a plan of action, as opposed to the author of that plan of action. I don't think he actually thought that.
I agree. So we're going to ask, I hope someone has a microphone. By the way, if some of you were wondering why Meacham sounds the way he does and I sound the way I do, it's because we're using the wrong microphones. That's the only reason for the disparity in voice.
Not in content.
No, I wasn't talking about content.
There are other explanations.
Timbre. Okay, who has a question? Yes, let's bring down a mic. Here it comes right here. Wait for the mic so our Zoom guests can hear you as well.
You said you don't think Lincoln is a target for cancellation. When I was a kid, I went to elementary school. We had George Washington on the left, Lincoln on the right, and I'm shocked that Washington's star has faded so quickly. Are you confident that Lincoln, I understand a statue of Lincoln was toppled at one point over his treatment of the Indians. Are you confident that Lincoln's legacy will remain and he won't be a candidate for cancellation?
No. I could go on. No, anything can happen, right? Arthur used to quote the Dutch historian, history is an argument without end. And that's absolutely right. My test on monuments and portraits and that sort of thing is, in public places, were you devoted to the experiment toward a more perfect union? And if you were, then we'll start the debate. If you were not, then I don't think you should be in a public place, which would take all the Confederates out. I just don't see it. And again, I grew up on a Civil War battlefield, so I went to a small Episcopal college called the University of the South. So anybody wants to argue about this, I'm ready. It's Sewanee. Some of you maybe one or two of you are not wildly familiar with it. It's best understood as a combination of Downton Abbey and Deliverance, both put together. But that's parenthetical. I think that there will be so Confederates are out, but Jackson, Madison, Lincoln. I mean, obviously, I think that we commemorate in order to remember things that we find virtuous, right? But if you only want virtuous, if you want absolute virtue in a statue, you will have no statues. And so I'm a big believer in judge not, lest ye be judged, and in judging people on the totality of their lives. And so therefore I would not, I love the Lincoln Memorial because you approach it as if it is a temple, as if it is an intersection of the divine and the temporal, and you look at Lincoln's face and it is human, and it's looking at us. It's not looking off heroically. It's looking down at us. And I think that if we can see what he saw when we look in the mirror, we'll be in better shape.
Yes, in the back.
Could you talk about Lincoln's choice of Andrew Johnson and whether he would have been surprised at what Johnson did when he succeeded him?
Not a great hour. Not an additional chapter in the unwritten second volume of Profiles in Courage. I think it was a terrible mistake for the country. I say that as a Tennessean, East Tennessean, where Johnson is from. I get the politics of it. you got to win. You know, President Bush used to say, politics is not a pure undertaking, not if you want to win, it's not, right? So was that the correct political calculation? Harold would have a better sense of that than I would. I think the lost presidency of Hannibal Hamlin is one of the great counterfactuals. If a New England Republican had become president of the United States on that Saturday, on Holy Saturday, in 1865, I think we'd be living in a different country.
But John, talk for a second about something we've explored before, this presidential sense of immortality.
Oh, it is amazing. When you take that constitutional oath, apparently you decide that you are not ever going to die. It's really interesting. They have this sense. FDR had it, you know. I could handle Stalin, you know, okay. Well, but you might be dead. No. Yeah, and there's one there for the grace of God. I mean, y'all are probably all Wallaceites, but I'm in the wrong place to say this, but it's a good thing Henry Wallace did not become the 33rd president, I think. There's something about it. I suspect it's about the ego of putting yourself forward, that you just don't think the ordinary rules of mortality apply. And you specifically asked me, sir, about would it have surprised him? I suspect so, but I fear not as much as I wish. Does that make sense? Because Lincoln was headed, you know, thank God, Harold and I have talked about this before, we would be having a different conversation about Abraham Lincoln today if he had had a cold on April 11th, 1865. I love being in an audience where I don't even have to finish that. Everybody gets it, right? And gave the speech he gave about Louisiana and extending the vote to black people. What if he had just decided, you know, I'm going to go play with Tad. I'm not going to give this speech. That speech is hugely important because it's the most vivid manifestation. He'd made a private suggestion to the governor of Louisiana, but then he made it public. And that gives those of us who want him, and let's be honest, who want him to be better on these issues than he was, that gives us something to hold on to. And I think our friend Eric Foner certainly has this argument about Lincoln as a growing person. I have a slightly different view. I think what's remarkable about Lincoln and his anti-slavery principle is how consistent he was, actually. But that didn't lead you to egalitarianism. And I think we would have seen more of that, perhaps in the Reconstruction period. But presidents never think they're going to die. And they joke about it, right? President Kennedy, you know, said, if somebody wants to change your life for mine, you know, that will happen. Remember what he said after the night the Cuban Missile Crisis ended. He said to Mrs. Kennedy, "This is the night I should go to the theater. It's never going to get any better."
Really? Yeah. Yes, ma'am, right there. Wait for the mic, please.
Thank you. Could you tell me if there was a specific, what was it that made Lincoln decide to go into politics, having been a lawyer, you know, a young man and a lawyer, and what was that? Was there a defining moment for him?
It's a great question. He it's kind of a Jacksonian thing. It was a way to get ahead. It was a way to have a place in the world. He had a very complicated family history, don't we all? But his was particularly so. There were rumors about his grandmother and mother's illegitimacy and promiscuity. There were questions about whether he was really the son of Abe Inlow. I always liked that name. He wanted to keep, you know, and he was in full emotional flight from his childhood. The moment he could get away, about 21, 22, when he gets to 22 when New Salem. It's like having Google right here. Who needs chatbot? I got Holzer. And so You're a very good you're a very good host for putting up with this. So it was the means of ascent for him, the right to rise. I believe that. And a quick story. There's one of the many essays I will never write is one of these counterfactual things. I don't think we would be here talking about Abraham Lincoln if not for a man named Samuel P. Hill, the storekeeper in New Salem, who took Abraham Lincoln's treatise, atheist treatise, saying there was no God. He was under the influence of Thomas Paine. He was probably in his mid-20s. He knows that Lincoln wants to be a politician in the United States. He reads this thing that Lincoln has written, and he throws it in the stove, destroying his atheist manifesto. If Abraham Lincoln had published an atheist manifesto, he would not have been president. This is my second example is that Ben Cartwright won the Cold War. Bear with me for a second. Bonanza goes on the air in 1961. Most expensive television show in American history. Full color, big hour, takes off in the ratings. Against a show on NBC that was black and white called GE Theater. Ronald Reagan got fired because the Cartwrights were so popular. He needed to find a line of work. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this Ponderosa. If I get a third, I'm going to write the essay, so watch out for it.
By the way, just one comment on the question. Lincoln was a politician before he was a lawyer. So he seeks a legislative seat, but then he says, I might as well read law so I know what I'm doing when I get there.
Chatholzer.com.
I think we'll do one more because we want to get our guest upstairs so that you can have an opportunity to buy books. And he's got 3 other engagements this evening, so I promised to get him out at a time certain. Yes, you get the last question. Here comes the mic. Wait
for the microphone.
There we go.
Too eager. I'm here representing the Upper West Side. So, John, I am so envious of your Southern loquaciousness. Did not come with my Budapest education.
They didn't have that in Southern Hungary?
No.
No?
But when I'm a little bit surprised that when the two of you, wonderful conversation, thank you, when the two of you refer to the hovering ghost of Lincoln in the White House, you said nothing about the immense event of his assassination and how that has really, really affected not only his presence in the White House, but his universal presence, just as I don't believe that there would be boulevards named for Kennedy in every major capital had he not been assassinated. And by the way, I think he's the only American president who expected to die young. He was, because he had had extreme unction delivered, a half a dozen
President
times.
Kennedy.
President Kennedy, yes, yes. Just to take up your
the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yes, yes.
So
they all think they're
the
immortal.
martyrdom
So the
factor,
martyrdom.
let's talk about that.
Harry Truman said about Franklin Roosevelt, heroes always know when to die. Right? When he was dealing with McCarthy and Robert Taft and isolationism, he was like, FDR knew when to go, right? And there's some truth to that about Lincoln, because he didn't have to disappoint us. We know he was not an egalitarian. We can now spend the rest of recorded time talking about, well, he was on an arc toward that. And the tragedy of Ford's Theater is like the tragedy of Dallas, perhaps, in terms of Vietnam. It's self-evidently presidents who were learning in office were cut down. And I think that's absolutely true. But to die on Good Friday, many Americans encountered the first public group in the wake of the news at Easter services. A lot of sermons were rewritten on Saturday. Queen Victoria, Harold has a marvelous book, an anthology about the assassination. And Queen Victoria wrote a very interesting note to Mary Todd Lincoln about how because she had lost Albert. I'm in a particular place to know what you are feeling. So it was, Cotty's right, it was universal. It was the largest funeral in American history.
Up until Grant's, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they took him around, how many cities was it?
11, something like that.
11 cities they stopped with the body, you know.
With open caskets.
Yeah. Yeah, so if you had the embalming contract. But I think, unquestionably, to have, and to die in the theater, and the hunt for Booth, and, you know, it's Greek.
Yeah, the Good Friday element is huge. And I will just put in one plug for the Upper West Side in its broadest interpretation.
I love the Upper East Side.
West. In this case, it was also Passover. So the allusions to dying as Jesus had, right, for our national sins is supplemented by the idea that Moses, he is the Moses to African Americans, but he doesn't get to see the promised land himself because it's left to Andrew Johnson.
Yeah, and Johnson turned us around and headed back to Egypt.
Right. And with that, please join me in thanking Jon Meacham.